Will Airbus become the next Boeing, going from crisis to crisis? With so much focus on Boeing's troubles in recent years, Airbus often seen as the safe, engineering-driven good guys of commercial aviation. And yet, Airbus recently rushed out emergency software updates for around 6,000 A320s. They found fuselage panels built to the wrong thickness. And elsewhere, authorities discovered a mystery issue that can and has caused engines of Airbus aircraft to shut down in flight. So, which is it? Did Airbus happen to catch a few random problems in quick succession, or are they an industry giant starting down the same troubled path that stained Boeing's reputation and created the 737 MAX crisis? Well, in this video, I'll be digging into Airbus's recent headaches to show whether the kind of issues that Airbus suffered recently are just outliers or precursors of the next full-blown crisis. Now, we've covered Boeing's troubled history a few times on this channel, so I'm only going to look at it briefly here, just to give you a frame of reference as we examine Airbus. In 1997, Boeing bought McDonnell Douglas, which had been in slow decline for some time. But looking back to Boeing's purchase, you could say that McDonnell Douglas bought Boeing, with Boeing's money. In the years that followed, most of Boeing's management, including its CEO, were replaced with a succession of former McDonnell Douglas executives who gradually transformed Boeing from an engineering powerhouse to a glorified spreadsheet company that focused on short-term returns at the cost of innovation and longer-term strategy. Boeing shed parts of its business that were suddenly thought of as non-core elements, like Boeing Wichita, which produced large aerostructures for all Boeing airliners, including the nose sections of every jet and the entire fuselage of the 737. That non-core operation was sold in 2005 and became Spirit Aerosystems, a move that was reversed only recently and at great cost. Crucially though, the effects of the post-McDonnell Douglas transition weren't obvious immediately, but gradually Boeing's company culture shifted. Instead of the engineers telling managers what was achievable and at what cost, the managers were now dictating the performance that engineers should achieve and with what budget, and how quickly everything had to be done. Inevitably then, deadlines started to compete in importance with getting things right. Even before the 737 MAX got into the picture, the development of the 787 gave people a first glance of where things were headed. Now, to be clear, the 787 is a superb aircraft, but development delays and so many production and supplier problems hit that plane, and costs spiraled so high that realistically it's unlikely Boeing will ever recoup its investment on the 787, no matter how many of them they end up selling. And then came the decision to launch the 737 MAX, which was problematic in itself, but not as problematic as the way the plane's development went ahead. And we've covered that in detail in other videos. Again, this was a long process with several telltale signs along the way. So, are Airbus's recent problems on the same level? Well, let's look at the problems. The first one that hit the news late last year was a problematic software update of one of the fly-by-wire computers that the A320 family relies on. On the 30th of October, a JetBlue A320 experienced an in-flight upset as it was cruising along at flight level 350 on its way from Cancun in Mexico to Newark in the United States as flight 1230. The aircraft was on autopilot when it abruptly pitched down. It didn't lose a lot of altitude, only around 100 feet or so, but the move was so sudden that anyone not secured in their seats was thrown upwards. The NTSB later stated that 10 people on board that flight suffered injuries and that they were investigating the event. What they and Airbus found was that one computer called ELAC-2 suffered a fault. But that's not all. A single computer failure shouldn't have caused an aircraft upset. Normally, such a fault would simply have caused another computer called ELAC-1 to take over. But clearly that didn't work. Then, 4 weeks later, Airbus announced that intense solar radiation may corrupt data critical to the functioning of flight controls. It turned out that a software update that Airbus had released for the ELAC-2 computer made it vulnerable to suffering faults related to solar radiation. Now, to be clear, Airbus didn't specifically say that the JetBlue upset was definitely caused by solar or other cosmic radiation, and space weather watchers stated that there wasn't really that much solar activity during the event. However, Airbus found that a software update with number L104 wasn't guarded properly against such cosmic radiation events. So they and aviation authorities worldwide issued a recall that immediately grounded 6,000 aircraft. Fortunately though, for most of these jets, the fix was pretty quick. Technicians simply needed to get on board, plug a device into the port in the cockpit, and change the software to an earlier version. Not hard, but certainly a time-consuming event, especially when you picture dozens of technicians pulling all-nighters in airport ramps around the world, applying this update or backdate to dozens or hundreds of aircraft. But around 1,000 out of the 6,000 affected aircraft needed the existing ELAC-2 computer to be physically swapped out of the avionics bay, which took considerably longer, not including the time needed to actually find the right computers and ship them to where they needed to be. So for some airlines, the effects of this problem were minimal, other than a frantic weekend for their engineers and other ground crew. But for some airlines that needed to swap those computers out, it took nearly a week for all planes in active service to be squared away. Now, I'm skipping a lot of detail in this story, but we have a full video on it with some input from our friend Alex of Astrum, who I hope you're already subscribed to. The thing is though, we ended that video by saying that the fact that Airbus reacted to this the way they did, by grounding thousands of aircraft with little warning, was actually a good thing. I said that this is exactly the kind of attitude that our industry should have if a possible problem is discovered, which looks like it might have safety implications. Ultimately, if there's a doubt, there's no doubt. Now, I still stand by that, but what was a bit worrying is that just days after this story broke, and while some of the affected aircraft were still grounded, waiting for those ELAC computers, another Airbus story broke, this time involving aircraft fuselage panels that were too thick or too thin. And I'll tell you about that after this. In aviation, we talk a lot about the risks of complacency, how incidents rarely occur because of one dramatic mistake, but instead develop from multiple smaller issues that get missed. And interestingly, the same thing can happen when we're online. Most cyber attacks don't start with somebody knowingly giving away their data. It's usually a normal looking logging page, a software update prompt, or a download that seems legitimate, until it isn't. But by the time you realise something's wrong, it's often too late. And that's why I've been using today's sponsor, NordVPN, and specifically their Threat Protection Pro feature. Threat Protection Pro checks the websites and files that you interact with before they can do any harm. It blocks malicious domains, stops phishing attempts, and scans downloads for malware, basically looking out for you while you browse. And importantly, it works even when you're not connected to a VPN server, so that protection is always running quietly in the background. For a research-heavy channel like this, where we open reports and archives from all over the internet, Threat Protection Pro is such a useful tool. It removes that moment of hesitation where you wonder if you should really click that link. And if you want to try it yourself, head over to nordvpn.com/mentor now, or scan this QR code. There's even a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can test it risk-free. Thanks NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to the story. Airbus received these panels from an aerostructure supplier in Spain called Sofitec. The panels are for the front half of the fuselage of the A320 family. In an EASA document, the problem was specifically linked to the S12 fuselage section, and Sofitec is one of two suppliers for this section of the fuselage. As it turned out, this company used a specific stretching and milling process that affected the thickness of its aluminium panels in undesirable ways. Initially, the story was that this issue only affected several dozen A320 family aircraft, but that number of panel sets later grew to 628. Now, to be clear, most of those affected panels didn't actually involve aircraft already in service. 215 were still in early assembly stages, and another 245 were at a more advanced stage of production or getting prepared for delivery to airline customers. But this leaves 168 affected fuselage panels that were fully built into aircraft, delivered to customers and in service. And that number was later raised further to 177 aircraft. And that meant that airlines now have to inspect these brand new planes to make sure that they're safe. And bear in mind here that some airlines were already struggling with having relatively new A320 family jets out of service because of the unscheduled engine inspection and repairs. The good news here is that EASA, the European Aviation Safety Agency that mandated these checks over 2 weeks after the issue became problematic, required airlines to perform a detailed inspection of these aircraft over a period of 6 months, which tells us that this isn't really a safety of flight issue. Otherwise, that would have caused them to ground the jets immediately. EASA did also specify a quicker local thickness mapping procedure, and it seems that many airlines had performed this check even before EASA's airworthiness directive was first proposed. Even so, several airlines had already started fully inspecting their fleet preemptively, which again is what we all want to see. Airbus is confident though that even in aircraft that are affected by this issue, the variation in thickness is small enough that in most cases it would still be within tolerance, requiring no repairs. But if repairs are necessary, they can take around 3 to 5 weeks. That's for aircraft already in service though. It's not clear how long repairs will take in partially completed aircraft, although the issue definitely affected Airbus's aircraft deliveries. In December, they revised their annual delivery target for 2025 down from 820 aircraft to 790, and they ended up delivering 793 jets. Now, if this story sounds a bit familiar, it's because we covered part of it in a previous monthly news roundup. And again, on its own, these skin issues may be just an unfortunate complication, but the timing, just days after the software update issue, definitely raised some eyebrows. And it also caused Airbus's shares to suffer a drop of 6.5% in just 5 days. Here it's worth pointing out that generally speaking, Airbus are a bit more vertically integrated than Boeing has been in recent years, meaning that Airbus produce more of their own components and structural parts for aircraft in-house rather than relying on vendors, which makes them less susceptible to such issues in theory. But this particular issue involves structural parts supplied by an outside vendor, which led some to draw parallels with Boeing's 787 manufacturing defect issues back in 2020. But that isn't just an apples to apples comparison. Some of those 787 issues involve parts coming from other suppliers, but those were composites, and the crux of the issue was how Boeing assembled them in their own facility. And of course, those issues caused the production of the 787 to stop completely for nearly a year and a half, with shorter stoppages before that. Clearly, the recent issues that Airbus had affected them nowhere near as badly, not to mention the rest of the headaches that Boeing faced in recent years. But then a third Airbus issue became public in December, literally hours after we learned of the skin thickness issue. Now this one got a lot less public attention than the other two, but many pilots did take note, because this is an issue that could cause an unintended in-flight engine shutdown. On the 3rd of December 2025, New Zealand's Transport Accident Investigation Commission released a report on an incident that happened a year earlier. Air New Zealand Flight 249 on the 1st of December 2024 was an Airbus A320neo departing from Wellington in New Zealand, heading to Sydney, Australia. On that day, the flight had 142 passengers and 6 crew on board. The flight departed on time, lifting off from runway 34 in Wellington at 3:52 p.m. local time. The captain was pilot flying, and the takeoff and climb were uneventful. The two pilots even had time to accept an offer from the cabin crew to serve them their lunch a little bit early. The aircraft levelled off at 36,000 feet for the cruise portion of the flight, but they only got to spend about 15 minutes there before a master caution tone and warning light told the pilots that something was wrong. The captain quickly noticed that the number 2 engine indications were rolling back. They had no idea why, but the Pratt & Whitney engine under the right wing was shutting down. The first officer heard some loud clicking noises, which seemed to come from behind the 2 seats, which led the first officer to think that they could be a system power change. Now, we typically can't maintain our cruising altitude after losing an engine, which is why in such an event we follow what we call a drift down procedure into thicker air. And the crew did exactly this, before following the engine shutdown checklist that appeared on their ECAM display. More checklists followed, and the crew let the cabin crew and their passengers know what was going on. They decided to divert to Auckland further north, where they landed safely on runway 05 right. In total, the flight had lasted for about an hour and a half. And you would think that this is where the excitement ended, but there was a little bit more to come. After the aircraft taxied in, Air New Zealand's duty management pilot in Auckland, a union support pilot, and an engineer got on board the aircraft. And as soon as they got onto the flight deck, one of them noticed something that the other pilots hadn't. The fire switch for the number 2 engine, the engine that unexpectedly shut down, was poking out in the activated position. Now, neither of the pilots could remember activating that switch, and the checklist they'd performed did not call for them to activate it. But when activated, a fire switch on any aircraft does several jobs, including cutting fuel to the engine, which of course explains why this engine was shut down. Now, the fire handle was not illuminated, which was normal because it would only have been illuminated if an actual fire had been detected on that engine. But this lack of illumination could explain why the 2 pilots missed the fire switch as they worked through their checklists. So what actually happened here? Well, it looks like this was an uncommanded fire switch activation, which is extremely rare but not unheard of in the global Airbus fleet. Another very similar event had happened in October 2023 with an A321 flying to Lisbon in Portugal. That crew diverted to Barcelona and also only noticed the popped out fire switch after parking their aircraft. And 4 other very similar events happened even earlier, the latest 2 in 2021 and 2016. In all of those events, and the latest one in Air New Zealand, there was one common thread. The cover of the fire switch was damaged. A small retaining pin inside the part was deformed and allowed the switch to self-activate and shut down the affected engine as it did so. The report on the Air New Zealand incident goes at some length to describe the issue, but the gist of it here is that this damage was not caused on the aircraft. It happened before the part was fitted. Now, according to Safran, the company that actually makes these fire switches, the parts were likely dropped at some point prior to installation. Some of these panels had been installed to other aircraft first and then removed for unrelated reasons and serviced, and as a result, the servicing process is also under scrutiny in the report. Now, this is not the final report on this incident, so while it lists some already issued recommendations and actions taken, more such recommendations should follow eventually. But there's a concern here that I have of something how simple, such as mishandling of aircraft parts in a warehouse, can cause that part to get damaged. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to fail in service and shut down an engine. And according to this investigation report, Airbus uses the same fire switch design for the A320, the 330, the 340, the 350 and the 380 aircraft. What does all this tell us then? Is Airbus on its way to a crisis similar to what Boeing has gone through? Frankly, it's difficult to say that from looking at the events we've looked at here, aside from the fact that all 3 of them were published essentially within a week of each other. Ultimately, Boeing's problems were cultural in nature, and at least on the face of it, Airbus doesn't seem to suffer from the same issue. Or do they? As I said at the start, Boeing's issues didn't happen overnight, and they weren't really obvious when they happened. But in the words of industry insider Scott Hamilton in Liam News, complacency and arrogance aren't a Boeing exclusive, a point he made nearly 3 years ago. And he gave some examples. For one thing, Airbus had issues with quality control at their assembly sites in Hamburg, Germany. Also, they were really slow in sorting out the production of the A220, and they made many small and a few big apparent sales errors, and customer support in markets like the US have been less than perfect. On the commercial side, Airbus has been quite reluctant to compete with Boeing on price, which seems easy to understand since their assembly lines are spoken for many years to come. However, Airbus aren't aggressive on price, even on wide bodies where Boeing are doing much better. In some respects, it's easy to see why Airbus might be getting a bit complacent. Why should they spend billions to design new aircraft, for example, when the airlines and lessors stand in line to buy the planes they're already making? And despite all of this, Airbus has still been spending more on research and development than Boeing. On the other hand, the fact that Airbus are ramping up production of the A320 to make 75 of these a month within a year or two from now does raise some eyebrows when vendor supplied parts cause serious issues and delays. Again, the problems of the 737 MAX and the 787 were on a different level to what we're looking at here, but those events were big lessons for the entire industry that really do need to be in the forefront of everyone's mind, especially now that geopolitics and possible competition from other players could bring more unpredictable challenges. But what do you think? Have any of the events or incidents involving one of the big players got your attention? What aircraft would you like Boeing or Airbus to introduce as they move forward? Let us know in the comments below. I'm Ben Watts. You're watching Mentor now. Have an amazing week, and I'll see you next time.